Good morning, Senators. The committee in the hall is now reconvened. In the hall, we have Vice Speaker Talahi, Speaker Cruz, Senator San Nicolas, Senator Regine Visco-Lee, Chairman of Education, Senator Joe San Augustine, Senator Tom Atta, and Senator Will Castro at the moment. I understand that our other colleagues are in transit. So we're gonna, because we do have a quorum, we're gonna continue our discussion on the proposed measure. Right now, we are on page 4, having adopted the amendment that was proffered by Senator Tom Atta. Senator Mike San Nicolas requested consideration to add an additional amendment to that amendment that was passed. Senator San Nicolas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have another amendment to include in this particular section that will affect the language that was amended yesterday. I also have a copy of it available for circulation. The amendment reads, in addition to availing, it will be added on page 4, line 3, after the letter A. In addition to availing of the services of the Department of Public Works, and then it will continue from there. The Guam Department of Education may solicit. And so what this amendment will do, Mr. Chairman, is it will allow for the Department of Education to avail of the public works services, and if the public works services are unsatisfactory, or if they are not moving fast enough, or if the Department of Education wishes to commingle DPW services with the services of an OAE, they may do either or both. And so this amendment will include that language in the beginning. In addition to availing of the services of the Department of Public Works, the Guam Department of Education may solicit. And if we can have copies made and circulated.
Okay, Senator San Nicolas, if I can just pull forward an inquiry. I understand the intent is to ensure that the services of DPW are availed by the Guam Department of Education, but would that circumvent the transfer of the procurement process to the Guam Department of Education as provided in this legislation?
Not in my interpretation, Mr. Chairman, because the department may avail of their services, but the procurement doesn't have to go through DPW. And so the way I'm reading it is, in addition to availing of the services of the Department of Public Works, the Guam Department of Education may solicit with a third-party provider. So they'll avail of DPW services or third-party provider services, but the procurement still is being handled by the Guam Department of Education, because what's being stricken here, and it's still in the original amendment, is the words through the Department of Public Works. It's not being done through the department. It's just language that says, in addition to availing of the services, which has been what the superintendent has been saying for the last couple of days already, that he does intend to avail of DPW services. And it's something that I would actually very much advise, given the nature of the conversation we had yesterday with respect to some of the risks of relying solely on a third-party provider.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. I wanted to make sure that that was on the record and that it will not take away from the core of this particular proposal. Okay, so the amendment that was adopted yesterday that was proffered by Senator Tom Atta, now there's an amendment by Senator San Nicolas to insert, prior to the beginning of that statement, in addition to availing of the services of the Department of Public Works, comma, and then continue on with that amendment.
Mr. Chair, I thought we took a recess to get copies, but I don't have one. Have they been passed out?
Okay, 1 minute recess. Committee in the whole is now back in session. You all have a copy of the amendment proffered by Senator St. Nicholas to insert at the forefront of that paragraph that was adopted yesterday, in addition to availing of the services of the Department of Public Works, comma, and then continue on with that amendment that was adopted yesterday. Any further discussion on this particular amendment? Any objections? No objections? So ordered. Thank you, Senator St. Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're still on Section 4.
Yes, we are still on Section 4 on page 4. Any further discussion on Section 4, page 4?
On the Tom Atta, we're still on the Tom Atta amendment.
That was adopted yesterday prior to the conclusion.
Yeah, it was already adopted.
Yeah. That's why Senator St. Nicholas's amendment was added to that amendment that was adopted yesterday. Any further discussion on page 4, Section 4?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, actually.
I'm sorry, did someone? Yes, Senator St. Nicholas, you recognize.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I haven't drafted this amendment because I wanted to kind of have the discussion first with the superintendent. You know, one of the challenges that we had when we built Ukuru was the unexpected population increase that resulted in us having to come right back here again and borrow to expand. And so I wanted to include in the solicitation that the specification shall include student population and projected growth of such population over the term of the leaseback. Because my concern is if we build a school and we have a 30-year period where we're paying it back and we didn't factor in population growth, then we're going to end up being stuck paying for a facility for 30 years and then having to come back again and expand that facility. And I think all of us throughout the island have experience with temporary classrooms going up in schools and, you know, the infrastructure challenges that presents, where the growth of the community presents challenges and it just impacts the schools. And so I was curious as to whether or not we can include as a requirement of the solicitation that the projected growth of student population be factored into the solicitation, so that the school that we build is going to be the school that we'll need for the next 30 years and not just what we need today. Mr. Chairman.
Did you want a response from the superintendent?
If he feels it's necessary.
Mr. Fernandez?
So first of all, on the whether or not to include the projected growth as part of the minimum or as part of the information in the solicitation, I think that's something we would want to include. I understand what you're saying about Ukuru High School and what was experienced there. When I'm not familiar with all the planning. You know, obviously, I would like to not weigh down the legislation with additional provisions. But I do understand that. I think the issue, so right now, you know, Simon Sanchez is at around 1,900 students. And we have projected with these last rounds of solicitations that have gone through DPW, we are projecting, you know, north of 2,100 students to allow for room for growth. So what I wanted to just bring to your attention is that we are going through the revision of attendance areas. And one of the anticipated potential, I mean, so it's not approved yet, but one of the anticipated issues is that it could result in additional relief at Simon Sanchez High School. So we're looking, you know, could be 100 to 200 students at this point, reduced enrollment simply by realigning the attendance areas. But of course, we would still want to see opportunities for growth. So, you know, I think in concept, you know, obviously it's something we want to factor in. If you want to put something in writing that we could look at, I'm sure that we could, you know, work through language. But right now, you know, I think the question for us as we go through the solicitation would be how much of a cushion do we want to build into that solicitation, and what cost will that incur as far as the total cost of the facility. So, because I think the other thing we are struggling with is that we do recognize for all of the schools up there, if you know, as you've gone through the attendance area review, there's still a lot of developable land in the north in Jigo, and we've seen a lot of recent developments happening there as well. And so we're recognizing that as we go through the attendance area review, and so it's a very relevant and issue to consider. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things that factor into it also. Like, I know that there's a number of students who go to other high schools because they move in with grandpa and grandma because The family doesn't want them going to that school because of the, you know, the challenges that that school presents. And so I'm just concerned that if we go out anticipating 200 less or status quo population, and then all of a sudden, you know, a lot of students want to go to the new school, or we have the military families moving over here and they see there's a new school right next to the base and they want their child to get a public school experience as opposed to a do-day experience. You know, those kind of things might impact our population. And then, you know, the last thing I want is to have either us having to come back and layer another borrowing on top of a borrowing, or be putting those temporary classrooms into just a brand new facility that was just built. So I would feel more comfortable if the solicitation included specifications that address the projected growth of student population over the term of the leaseback. And if that's amenable to the panel, I would like to make that amendment at this time. Mr. Chairman.
Do you have the verbiage, Senator St. Nicholas?
Yes, it will be on page 4, line 12, after the word considered.
Okay.
So line 12, that basically says the solicitation shall specifically state the minimum specifications that will be required for a submitted proposal to be considered. I wanted to add the language, such specifications shall include the projected growth of student population over the term of the leaseback. Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Fernandez.
No, if I may, the only concern I would have, it would be to be held to a 30-year projection of student growth. I think that's really difficult to do. So obviously when we project student growth, you really would want to look at projecting housing development, right? So that's a factor of looking at the financing environment and demand for to build housing in that area, and then as a part of that, how many of those housing units are going to be, you know, multifamily units, or they're going to be homes where we're going to likely see students, and so even then we're going to have to do a projection on that. And so I think we could, work through a projection, but I don't know that we could do it for 30 years. I could anticipate looking maybe a 5-year projection would be reasonable. You know what I mean, in terms of if we're going to be, I guess the issue is, I don't know how that projection is going to be accurate, or at least I don't have that data now. So there, I guess a time frame, if you're saying you've got to include a 30-year projection, I don't want to be challenged with regard to the accuracy, so I'm just kind of concerned about the length of time. So, but I mean, obviously we would want to project for a particular period of time that would be reasonable. I just think 30 years is really impossible.
Senator Nicholas?
Yeah.
What I'm more looking for is, like, let's say for example you estimate like a 2% or a 3% annual growth rate, and then you just factor that into the 30 years. And the reason why I'm looking at the 30 years is because that's the life of the leaseback. And so if the life of the leaseback is going to be for 30 years, but after 5 years the population of the school can be higher than what that leaseback has provisioned for, then that means that after 5 years we may have to be doing additional construction up at the school. Ideally, what perhaps this amendment might result in, Mr. Chairman, is the solicitation including plans that will have the bidders putting into their plan how they're going to address that growth. So maybe the bidder will put in a plan that says, after 5 years, we're also going to add this building as part of the leaseback, and then this building as part of the leaseback. And so you'll have almost like a school that grows with the community, as opposed to a fixed asset facility that eventually becomes too small for its community, and then we're back here trying to find a solution. So I would, and maybe perhaps the amendment should also include as determined by GDOE. So there's no one coming in saying, who's coming up with this growth rate? You guys come up with it. You guys say it's a 3% growth rate projection. And then the solicitors, the bids have to come in, and then you guys look at it and say, wow, this is a plan that's going to address the full 30 years, the full student population growth, and they're going to bring in these new assets as the time passes. I think that's something that can really be a long-term fix for the community, and I wanted to kind of just have the dialogue, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator St. Nicholas. I know on your amendment, there's been a request for a copy, so if I can ask you to work with the clerks so that we can, in fact, circulate it. In the meantime, Speaker Cruz, you have your hands raised, and then Senator Castro.
I understand the proposal that's being made. I'm just wondering, I don't think we've repealed the Casper-Bauer amendment on the maximum size of a school. And so I understand that there may be a need to expand, and I know that when we did Okudu, the expansion was built there because there was opposition to us doing it over by the soccer field. I remember that we were looking at a high school over there, and there was opposition to building the other northern school next to Juan Guerrero. So the default was to do Okudu, since Okudu had the land. I think maybe what can be done is to make sure that the design is such that, like Okudu, if there was a need, there would be a way to do the expansion, as opposed to the Simon Sanchez model, which was completely enclosed, and there was absolutely no way to add on to that octagon or whatever that building was. It would seem to me that that would be the way, that whatever the design is, that there would be a contingency, not a contingency, but at least some forethought that if we were to do an expansion, it would be off D wing, and there would be this wall that could possibly be knocked out to continue it into the E wing and F wing to add on. But I also want us to caution us about building too large a school.
Correct, right.
You have Southern High School with at least two wings that aren't being used.
Correct.
Thank you, Speaker Cruz. Senator Will Castro.
Just wanted to say that absolutely right. So I guess that's why I'm trying to get clarity on the amendment. We could obviously include a projection of what we thought student enrollment would look like up north, and I don't want to be, bound to any particular format or the accuracy of that. But I think the speaker is right. Right now we worked very hard to bring student enrollment below to the 2,000 level, just due to the concern about safety and being able to staff those schools. So most of our high schools are operating under that 2,000 level, whereas I think in 2012, JFK and GW had been around 2,500. I know Southern is different than the other opposite extreme of having about 1,400 students in a school that was built to potentially house 2,500. So I guess that is a relevant factor. With Okudu, with the Okudu example, we could construct this solicitation to provide for a basic proposal on the school plus additive components should expansion be needed in the future. That might be an option, but again, it would be subject to an overall cap on enrollment, so we don't end up in a situation with a overcrowded school or a school that has overcapacity.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. Senator Will Castro.
I just wanted to verbalize my support of Senator Nicholas's amendment. I think it's reasonable. If anything, the modeling based on the live birth rate, which RP&E does a great job of tracking, or even the migration patterns by region, or even the student enrollment patterns that you have established, if anything, it gives us a pretty good basis and an understanding based on data. No one, I think, is going to challenge necessarily the model based on, historical data, but 10, 15, 20 years from now, we can look back and say, now how did we manage to get to this point in time? And I think with the buildup happening, we don't understand yet fully what's going to happen, in those areas with additional developments for low-income housing. So I think it's just common sense planning to include that type of reference material. So I just want to support Senator Nicholas' amendment in that regard.
Thank you, Senator Castro. I believe Andy Leongura wanted to add a comment.
Good morning. Senator Nicholas, your thoughts are really very important, because when we had built JFK back in about 2010, 2011, what we did was we took 20% growth rate on top of the number of students that were projected to attend the school. So we went from 1,800 to 2,300. And I don't know, Super, if we've capped the number of students at JFK right now. I'm not sure, but that was with a 20% growth rate. And Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've done the same for Simon Sanchez, if I'm not mistaken. We've also included a 20% growth rate on top of the existing population that is expected to attend the school once the new school opens.
Thank you, Mr. Leongoro. Senator Espadon and then Senator Cap.
Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering if we can just take a look at the amendment. I mean, everybody's speaking to it, and I'm sorry, but I wasn't able to get the full articulation of the
Okay,
amendment.
30-second
and so-
recess. The amendment's on standby right now. So
Thank you.
30-second recess for distribution. Good morning, Senators. The committee in the hall is now back in session. You do have a copy of the amendment that was proffered by Senator St. Nicholas to insert on line 12, page 4, right after the word considered.
Mr. Chairman, if I may
Yes, Senator St.
clarify.
Nicholas?
On the amendment that's been passed out, if the body can just strike the word include and replace it with the words factor in. And this is in consultation of the superintendent. So it will read, such specifications shall factor in the projected growth of the student population over the term of the leaseback as determined by the Guam Department of Education.
Thank you very much, Senator St. Nicholas. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Senator Castro?
I just want to add again, Mr. Chairman, take us back to the days of the civilian military task force that we once had. Remember when Senator Lamarena was leading that discussion with Colonel Dave Okada? And, you know, although we're narrowing our discussion to public school student enrollment, you know, really this is a good reference point because there's a much broader educational community out there like the private schools. And I hope, it's my intent, I hope that we have a much more vibrant, even charter school community that may be able to absorb some of these costs. And so just having this document is important for a larger discussion. And so I appreciate the amendment. And again, I just wanted to reaffirm my support for the amendment that Senator St. Nicholas proffered.
Thank you very much, Senator Castro. Senator Fernandez would like to add some comments.
Not Senator, the superintendent. No, but I just wanted to clarify that. I think with this language, what would be included in the information included in the solicitation would include that, you know, projection over that leaseback, but then the actual specifications for the facility, whether it's for the base proposal or for any additives, would incorporate it. But at a certain point, we're going to have to cap the enrollment at some point. So, if you projected 700 students over 30 years, but we would cap it at 2,000 or 2,100, it would at least present the information so that we understand that it's not going to be sufficient to incorporate all that growth and then inform our other discussions about charter schools or other schools that are needed. So we can do that.
Right, and in addition, Mr. Chairman, to that and to some of the previous discussion, you know, I know that there's a law in the books as to size of schools, but I also know that if there's no money to build a new school and the population increase needs to be addressed, the department is going to address it, and they're going to do whatever is necessary, whether it's temporary classrooms, whether it's jamming a partition in between a room to split a classroom. And so I think that just having the mindset of being prepared for these things and maybe even putting them into the A&Es and having just the foresight of saying, hey, you know, if we don't have the money to build a brand new high school because of these population issues, what is going to be phase 2, Simon Sanchez, to keep the student population and the learning environment conducive while also having it perhaps even included in the leaseback that was offered. So maybe what I would advise as this moves forward is that the panel, or I'm sorry, the evaluating committee look at these proposals also as like option 1, option 2. So like, this is the leaseback for the school at the static population. If you exercise option 1, that would bump it up 200 to 300 students. This will be the leaseback for the remainder of those years. If you exercise option 3, because there's no new school and your population just keeps growing, this is how the lease will be amended for the remainder of those years. And so it will give the department the flexibility to grow the school within the leaseback in a single transaction rather than us building to spec with the narrow view of the current population and then getting caught by surprise 10 years later. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator St. Nicholas. On the amendment as proffered by Senator St. Nicholas to read, such specifications shall factor in the projected growth of the student population over the term of the leaseback as determined by the Guam Department of Education. Any further discussion? Senator Vice Speaker Talai, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I very much appreciate the sponsor bringing this topic up because, yes, it makes sense that DOE in building Simon Sanchez High School, I would hope, already knows, you know, what their projected growth rate will be, or even, you know, because we just read in the paper yesterday about an 80 years DOE has been sitting on federal land, did not use it to build a school, but it was always my understanding that we were in need of another northern school. And I guess I just want to know for the record, is DOE saying that we don't need additional capacity in the north? I heard that from the Department of Public Works that currently the specifications show Simon Sancho's current population at 1,900, and so the 20% growth rate is 2,300, and that's what the current specs are asking for, a school that can hold 2,300. And do you feel, Mr. Superintendent, that 2,300 is, what is the population at Ukudu, may I ask, with the expansion?
I believe the population is around 1,500 right now. The capacity is 2,000. So, and I'd like to invite all the senators, at some point it'll be before the board, but we are having our village meetings on the attendance areas. So I think in some of the preliminary discussions, there is capacity for growth at Ukudu. And so if the proposals hold right now, Ukudu would see an increase in their enrollment from 15 to about 1,600 or 1,700, and Simon Sanchez would be down by about 150 students or so. So just going through this process, which we hope to wrap up in May, will give us new numbers as to where we are today, and then we would project from there as to what additional capacity would be.
But even
important.
before your hearings that you're conducting right now, don't you have a plan?
Do we have a
Didn't you have
plan?
one, for example, what Senator Castro referred to when we had the whole buildup being proposed? DOE had to come in with their projections of how much capacity we needed in schools. I'm thinking that in your discussions with U.S., I don't know if it was DOD or DOE that gave you the land for 80 years, that you talked to them. I hope you didn't tell them we don't need another school up north. That's,
no.
I guess, so what do you have in writing already before these meetings that you're conducting right now? Because, yeah, waiting for, another round of public town halls or whatever meetings you're going to conduct to tell us what we're going to do with the Simon Sanchez has been part of the, doesn't seem appropriate to me. I appreciate that we have some particular specs and that they were able to tell us what those were based on, current plus 20%. And if we can or should be going bigger than that, then I would think that DOE should have said that early on. And the public auditor was very clear at the public hearing on this bill that part of the issue was that DOE, I'm going to read her words because they're not my words, but she said DOE did not know what it wanted. DOE did not have the foggiest idea of what they wanted for Simon Sanchez. A procurement takes a long time when the government does not know what it wants, and that's fundamentally what I saw. And so when they were asking her how to forgo the delay, I understand the intention of this, but I'm hoping that DOE has already in place some concrete planning as to growth of schools and how much capacity do we need up north for high schools, middle schools, whatever. And because we've never heard, I don't know, I just don't want to let this be, as written, it seems vague to me. We're going to plan capacity for 30 years. I mean, are you even able to do that? What is the 20% growth rate account for? Is that for the next 5 years or for 30 years?
Right now it's for the duration of the 30-year term.
30 years. All right, well, if you're able to do it, that's great. But I guess I'd like to see that should have, I mean, there should be something that exists that shows us what you are predicting in growth rate for all the schools up north, isn't there? Doesn't that exist already?
Like I said, I support the amendment. I think it would be helpful to include the 30-year projection on student enrolment. And
but he said they did that. Did you do that yet or not? That's what I'm asking. Are we starting from scratch again, and you're going to predict what is going to go into the specs?
Ma'am,
or do you have something that exists that shows what you have already predicted, what DOE has predicted for the government of Guam?
So we did build in capacity at Okudu and Simon Sanchez design. Do I have a comprehensive?
Say that again. What did you say?
So when school by school, we've done this in the past. As you know, as I mentioned.
No, but I mean, for your island, do
Right.
you have, doesn't DOE responsible for predicting what schools we need, whether we need to build more
Right, so.
elementary or middle
I'm sorry,
or
Mr.
high
Fe-
school?
Mr. Fernandez, Vice Speaker, if we can yield to the Speaker, he wants to inject some point of information. Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Chairman, in the statute already, Section 117, entitled Limitations on Capacity Levels for the Construction of New Public Schools. All public schools built on Guam shall be designed and constructed for student enrollment capacity limits as follows. At least elementary, middle. For high school, high schools shall not to exceed 1,700 students. The student capacity limitations of this section shall apply only to school projects initiated after September 30th, 1997. The department may, subject to the approval of the Guam Education Policy Board, exceed the capacity limits set forth in this section, provided that such adjustment would not endanger student and employee health and safety. These provisions shall not apply to school campuses that are temporarily used for double sessions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Vice Speaker Talai, you still have the floor. On the amendment.
So is that, I guess just to follow up with the speaker's comment, is that then, was that done? Did the board decide that there is no risk to increasing the capacity from 1,700 to 2,300 for the new Simon Sanchez?
I don't believe the board took official action, although they've been informed of the scope.
Do you think there is risk?
Risk of?
Increasing the capacities of the schools from Simon Sanchez in particular from 1,700 to 2,300?
I do believe that our policy, that our practice has been to try to get those enrollment numbers down below 2,000. That isn't an established policy by the board. Obviously, the law supersedes that. So, I think, when we scope out this school, based on the revised enrollment numbers as we revise the attendance areas, and should there need to be, a board approval of the ultimate capacity that we would put into specifications, they would need to take action.
So do you intend to redo the specifications that you've already submitted to DPW if this law is passed?
I intend to review the specifications and make any adjustments that we deem necessary.
What do you deem necessary today?
What I deem necessary is the authority to go and be able to review those specifications and make those adjustments as necessary.
No, I mean, what do you deem necessary to adjust in the current specifications that are currently in play? That's what I'm talking about. The DOE, the OPA repeatedly told us its DOE was not able to submit specifications. We've got current specs, and I want to know, so between that time and now, what has changed? What are you going to change in the specs? If you are going to start from scratch, and with this amendment, for sure, you're going to have to start from scratch. What are you going to...
Respectfully, I don't know that I would like to get into those details at this stage. What I would say is that the legislature gave the authority to the Department of Public Works. We have followed their lead. They've developed specifications with our input. If we are given the authority, we'll review the specifications in light of current and projected enrollment, which is bound to change, especially given the fact that we're revising our attendance areas, and we already know that there may be changes as soon as next school year. And so any new information that would inform the improvements of the specifications, we would take into consideration if we're given the authority to move forward.
So you're saying that the specifications are going to wait until you're done with your public hearings on your realigning attendance areas?
I'll say that I've spent 2 days here just discussing whether we should get the authority. I haven't dedicated a team to fully go over the specs at this stage, knowing that DPW is charged with that responsibility, and we continue to work collaboratively. That process is stayed right now. There's no telling when the courts will act. If DPW retains authority, I assume we're just in the waiting game, and we'll rely on the legislature's guidance to continue to follow DPW's lead. So we obviously will continue to work with DPW and give them new information as it comes forward. But what I'm saying is I don't have responsibility to drive and to alter and to adjust the procurement at this stage. I've been approached to potentially, revisit the specs. I don't think the procurement process allows us to move forward with the existing procurement and the discussions that would go around the table while it's in court and while it's protested to the OPA. So discussions have stopped.
Okay, I'm not understanding you, Mr.
Okay.
Superintendent. What are you saying? I'm asking you a very specific question. Do you intend to come up with new specs if this bill is passed? Different than the ones that you agreed upon with
Right.
DPW? And don't wash your hands of it because
Possibly.
you're part of the committee, and for
Right.
I think
Possibly.
DOE has been on this committee since the inception, so
Right,
you can't
possibly.
say it was only DPW. It was a committee work.
Right,
Pardon?
possibly.
Possibly rewrite the specs
Possibly revise.
after this current procurement is either terminated or something else.
Possibly
And
revise the
after the
specs.
realignment attendance area hearings.
Right, I'm not prepared to say that I will not revise the specs once given the authority to make those changes. So I would commit to reviewing it.
What about what you want in the schools? Do you intend to revise that?
Excuse me?
What you want in the schools? That was DOE's sole role. I mean, not sole role because you were also on the evaluating committee, as the OPA also makes comment about the review by the evaluating committee being
Correct.
cursory, and that's why one of the protests showed that the company that was awarded actually did not comply, did not submit all the information that was required. So she points out that the review by the committee, including you, was cursory. So I'm asking you now, and then she talks about, and we've heard it for years, that DOE was not very clear what they want in the school. So when they go in and they start to negotiate, that's what takes a long time, is renegotiating from scratch pretty much what we want in a school or what the contractor's going to put in. So they changed that law so that
Correct.
hopefully those, and to your credit, I want to say Public Works, this is reading again from the this article on the public hearing. Public Works Deputy Director Andrew Leon Guerrero said the specifications for the new high school have been streamlined, working with DOE to provide a, quote, functional, practical school, unquote, with funding left over to spend on other schools. He was unable to say how much would be left over pending the result of the invitation for bids, which will award the high school project to the responsive bidder with the lowest price. So
Sure.
hopefully there has been progress, but I'm asking you, yes, are you not satisfied with the current description of the school, what's going to go into that school? Because specifications include, how you're going to construct it, but I'm asking you about the design of the school. Do you intend to make changes to that? Are we really intending to start from scratch?
Just
I will
point
go
of
ahead and
information, Mr. Chairman. Well, with respect to the amendment that we're entertaining, the amendment would actually require the specs to be changed if it factors in the growth, the projected growth.
Exactly. That's
So
my point, Mr. Speaker.
Correct. That's what I said. I mean, I would be
And so-
possibly revising it to reflect enrollment.
And I'm asking him if this bill is, what else are you going to change? I mean, what is it that you intend to change without this amendment? This is growth of the student population, but I'm asking you if you were satisfied
Right.
with the current design of the school, or if you intend, regardless of this amendment, to go in there and make changes to that design at this point.
Okay.
Have you made any additional
I'll try to answer
plans?
your question as best as I can. I respectfully disagree with the public auditor on her on her description that we failed to give clarity about what we wanted. Now, I think that reflects the history of this procurement process. When we started out with an all-out bid for $100 million, there was not clarity on how much funding should be set aside for the school, and we kind of had, we estimated, but really, when DOE was asked to provide the needs that it had, we simply went to the community and asked for, to generate the general specifications for how many rooms would be needed, what type of collateral equipment would be needed, what collateral facilities would be needed, sports fields, theaters, and we provided that as part of that process. Over time, through the procurement process as it's gone along and through the legislature's actions, we've gotten more clarity. Number one is that the legislature essentially capped the amount that could be spent, number one. Number two, in this bill, there is the opportunity to divide this procurement up so that when you say, do we know what the design of this was? Of course not, because in the original procurement, it was an all-out, all-in-one bid where you had one firm who would take these general specs and they were supposed to go design, cost out, and finance. We're saying that that is ambiguous. That is an ambiguous way to go about it because we,
We've told you that over numerous hearings. So
No,
what you're repeating
absolutely.
is something we already know. We've asked you repeatedly why didn't you start with this certain design? Why didn't you do it another way? And you had that option. Those were not mandated. Not even the leaseback was mandated in the first law. So all
Right.
I'm asking is, do you intend, regardless of this amendment, to go in and make changes to the design of the school, or do you have something?
So,
Is there
Senator
something that
Lahi,
we can see?
The bill that I
you're in-
participated in helping to bring to the table here with Senator Uggan and with the committee is intended to facilitate the procurement with that in mind, which is to be able to produce a clear design that could be bid out for construction and financing. That was not available. The suggestion to amend and provide the services of an owner's agent engineer, absolutely excellent suggestion. We appreciate it. I spoke with DPW earlier. I mean, it's something that we would all have appreciated, that ability, as autonomous agencies have, to go and secure that expertise. So what you're asking me, was that available in the earlier procurement stages?
No, that's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you if you have any additional, we saw your list, we asked you this during the public hearing, and we saw some of the lists that were attached to the bid packet, right? Or the RFP at that point.
Correct.
I can't remember. And then, so I asked DPW, did that list change between the RFP and the most recent solicitation?
Correct. So we have
Did it change?
Yes. So
All right, and-
basically, it had been, I mean, again, when there was
So now all I
no,
want to know is, do
cost
you have
issue.
an additional list of changes that you intend, if this bill's passed, that you're gonna rewrite those,
right. So,
that wish list
right.
of DOEs? Is
Mr.
that your intention?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
yes.
While I appreciate
Your
this,
point of-
Mr. Chairman, while I appreciate this discussion, I believe it's misplaced right now. The only
I
issue-
object, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr.
if I
Speaker,
may,
that's not a
Mr.
point
Speaker,
of
if I may
order.
allow,
Let him finish.
thank you, Mr.
I have the
Let
floor,
him
Mr.
finish.
Speaker.
This is a point of order, Mr. Speaker. Point of order is allowed to proceed. Bottom line, the point of order is, what's before us right now is an amendment to basically says the specifications shall factor in the projected growth of student population. That's the issue, the only issue before us right now. Whatever
Mr.
ideas
Speaker,
and
if he's
whether,
going to cite
Mr.
a point of
Speaker,
order,
I
he
still
has
have
to
a point
cite
of
a
order.
point of
We're in
order.
recess.
Cite a rule that cites a violation of a rule. That's a point of order, not your opinion as to whether it's relevant or not.
Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, just to bring the tone down a little bit, the only issue before us right now is whether or not the amendment should be voted for or against. And the amendment basically calls for that the specifications shall factor in projected growth of student population. That's all it is. Should we or should we not support this idea that the solicitation should factor in projected growth, as opposed to the line of questioning? And again, maybe...
Objection, Mr. Speaker.
Mr.
Point of
Speaker.
order. He's debating in the middle of, while I have the floor.
Mr. Speaker.
I have the
And I
floor,
don't
Mr.
believe that
Speaker.
you're not going to get the answer that you want from him. He's tried very hard. And
I'd
so
like to
let's
show
move
that on the record, whether we're going to get the answer or not. Mr.
I think
Speaker?
you showed it with 6 times and he's not answered it. Let's move on. Do you have anything further after that?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I guess I want to show my colleagues that if we are going to start again with the new wish list of DOE, I can't see how this bill streamlines our procurement of Simon Sanchez High School. It's taken them so long to come up with the list that DPW could use, and then so much criticism about that list that it allowed for all kinds of, fluctuations in price because it wasn't specific enough or whatever. And so I'm making my point, Mr. Speaker.
I know you've shown it. Now move on to your next question.
Mr. Speaker, that's not.
The chair put a 5-minute limit.
All
Are
right.
you ready to move on, or should I move on? Thank you. Senator Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Although I understand the nature of the previous discussion, there are a number of factors that come into play. First and foremost, and we're talking about attendance and the specifications that could be incorporated into the proposal. You highlighted, Mr. Speaker, that there's an attendance maximum requirement by law of 1,700 per high school. Any deviation from that would require the concurrence of the Guam Board of Education. In addition to that, so in this case, should this amendment pass, the superintendent still has to go to his board, justify any add-ons or expansion of this facility to be able to accommodate that particular requirement by law. Secondly, the superintendent also highlighted that based on the attendance realignment proposal, that they're looking at reducing the population at Simon Sanchez High School from 1,900 to about 1,700 or 1,750. So should that attendance realignment proposal pass, then we're looking at a smaller population, and he's already concurred, the superintendent has already concurred and supported the amendment that he's willing to be forward-looking so that in fact the facility that's going to be constructed will accommodate an anticipated increased population. So I don't know where the issue is with regards to looking at this and asking some of those specifics, because the superintendent, to his defense, really cannot answer all these questions. He has to go before the board, get the concurrence of the board. If this is inserted, then he has that authorization to incorporate that into the plan so that in fact is considered. So to me, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I think we need to move for the previous question, if it's okay with the other senators in the hallway, and let's proceed with the continued discussion of this proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I feel that, this is very relevant to the discussion that the previous speaker has said. This amendment says, such specifications shall include the projected growth of the student population over the term of the leaseback as determined by the Guam Department of Education. So all the questions that the good senator from Jonia brought up is very relevant to the situation. And also, Mr. Speaker, the citing of the public law from chapter 17, let me just pull it up. Yeah, sorry, we've been going through the course of things. That was said earlier, Mr. Speaker, limitations on capacity levels for the construction of new public schools. It specifically gives a population not to exceed. And now we are seeing that a population has been exceeded. There's a population that will be exceeded, and we're looking to now project growth over student population over the term of the leaseback for schools. And now we're looking to give the superintendent of DOE, it may not even be the superintendent in front of us, depending on what happens in the next couple months or so, but whoever it will be, we're looking to give the superintendent of DOE the authority, which was the amendment that we passed yesterday, the authority to review and approve the proposed procurement by the owner's agent engineer. And I think that all these questions are relevant that the speaker from Jonia brought up, because one, it is very clear that he couldn't answer the questions. And please don't take this, I have a deep affinity for what you do, and I respect you as a person. But these issues have not been looked at. They have not been studied. And so now, on top of the superintendent having to address the bullying in schools, the Common Core, the situation that our teachers face where those schools are overpopulated. We're giving him this bill now to also look at being the owner's agent. And so that is the conflict that I have with determining the student population, because it has not even been looked at, and it's been proven that many times smaller schools are more conducive to students' safety and learning, and smaller classroom sizes. And so if we give him this carte blanche over, I don't know, a leaseback term of 25 to 30 years, we're not focusing on the issues that, you know, we do need to build more schools. We do need to address the population size. And just continuing to expand on top of properties and over schools is not the solutions that will help our students, nor our teachers, nor our aides, nor any support staff that is representing Guam Department of Education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just a point of information, Mr. Speaker. I believe the superintendent will be there next year and for a subsequent year. So just to clarify,
All right.
yes,
Thank
he
you.
still has a contract.
Senator Castro.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you for that point of information.
You know, taking into consideration all that's been said, I too share the sentiment, you know, concerns that we may possibly repeat another Southern High scenario. And I just have some very straightforward questions for the superintendent, because I don't think we've put it forward as clearly and with a yes or no question. So, Mr. Superintendent, with the assistance of your staff, would you be able to provide this body with a live birth rate? I've seen those documents in the past. I'd like to see it if you could supply that. I'm almost done. Could you also supply us with the census data? I can facilitate that with BSP. And could you also please kindly provide us with the school student enrollment data, at least for the past 5 years? Is that possible? Are you capable of producing that data set?
Yes, we can produce that for you.
Okay, great. And also, for my edification, will you also assure this body that you'll take those planning considerations to bear when you're looking at the construction of the new Simon Sanchez High School?
No, absolutely. I think this amendment that incorporates projected enrollment growth, of course, would be very helpful to ensuring that the specs are done appropriately for the students at Sanchez High. I also want to just say that, of course, given the discussion about the cap, the cap in the law, as well as the board's involvement in approving any population in excess of that cap, all those steps would be taken and abided by as part of this procurement.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I guess my point would be, you know, I'm hearing that we don't possibly even have the information, and I know you do, and I'd like to see it, and then I'd share with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, gentlemen, again for being here with us today. My question for the panel, I guess, would be, given your procurement experience, what would you say to members of this body and members of the community that may have concerns with an amendment like this, potentially opening us up for future challenges, and then therefore future delay in getting this school rebuilt?
If you're referring to the amendment to factor in projected enrollment growth, if that's the question,
Yes.
Because it allows us to factor it in, I don't think that would be able to be challenged on its face. I think, you know, obviously if we put something into the solicitation itself that, you know, was questionable, it might arise. But this amendment on its face, I don't think it would be subject to challenge. It just requires that we factor in the projected enrollment growth. For me, that means we ought to ensure that a projected enrollment growth is clarified and provided, and then to be able to create a reasonable connection between the specifications in the procurement and that growth, that rate of growth.
Mrs. Masi, thank you.
Senator Ada.
Mr. Chairman, I think this this amendment that has been proffered is certainly very important and relevant, because now when the design for the school is being made, if now we have to take a look at, you know, what is the projected growth, that may very well influence the configuration of that building such that, you know, it's kind of like the idea of we build a single family home, right, for just a husband and wife, but you configure it in a way that then when the family starts to grow, the plumbing is already there and all you need to do is put additional walls and whatnot. And so that, you know, so this is very important. Now, insofar as the specifications that go out today for the solicitation to construct, you base it on what we have now, but you know, it's hard for the superintendent to see down the next 20 years. He can project, but the further out it goes, the softer it gets. But you got to take that into account and see that population growth, despite the fact that there's a law that says that you will not have a population greater than so much. That's the way we see things today. We just don't know what it's going to look like, you know, down the road, and we've got to anticipate that. So at least, you know, there's the concerns on the educator's side about, you know, a school population greater than so much is not healthy and safe. Okay, that's very valid. But then, you know, from the engineer's perspective, if all things being equal, if you needed to expand that school, then you know at least you have that room to grow because you have taken that into consideration. So I think this amendment certainly is very appropriate and very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada. On the amendment, Senators, there's been a request by one of our colleagues to invite a member of the board to the front. So can I request the Sergeant at Arms, please, if you can swear in. I believe the Vice Chair, Mrs. Maria Gutierrez, is outside in the hallway. So we'll take a 1-minute recess. Committee in the whole is now back in session. Senators, there was an inquiry as to who requested the presence of a representative from the board, and that was myself when in fact the speaker was previously sitting as chair. So moving forward, if there's any questions with regards to attendance, because the provision that was cited by law, which is Title 17, subsection 7113, provides an allowance for the Board of Education to be able to exceed the recommended school attendance requirement or restriction, and that's where the board member would come into play in terms of responding to any questions. So if there's any questions, any further questions on the proposed amendment. Yes, Senator Lee.
I don't believe we have a quorum at this point.
We were in recess. We did have a quorum when we commenced the discussion this morning. So I'm working off of that format. Senator Lee.
Mr. Chair, if we're going to vote on this measure, we need to be able to have a quorum.
Senator Lee, we had a quorum when I reconvened the committee in the hall this morning at approximately 9:30. Okay, now we have a quorum. I have no control over any of our colleagues, Senator Lee, especially sitting as chair, if in fact we decide to go step out and use the restroom or whatever the case may be. So moving ahead, on the amendment by Senator Sir Nicholas, and please be clear that the language is such specification shall factor in the projected growth of the student population over the term of the leaseback as determined by the Guam Department of Education. Any further discussion? Senator, Vice Speaker, you're recognized.
Thank you. Welcome to Mrs. Gutierrez, the board member and former chairperson. I'd just like to ask her, since she's here, if are you able to help us with information as to DOE's master plan and what is their projected growth or their projected need for northern high schools, and how did they come up with the school size in the current Simon Sanchez solicitation or procurement that's ongoing?
Thank you, Vice Speaker. I think our superintendent has answered that, and I was sitting back out there. I really didn't intend to come in here. Yes, but you know, there's some questions that you guys are out of order. In all due respect, I respect your position, but there are questions there that you guys are out of order. So as far as the master plan, we were not involved in the master plan as a board. But when you guys are asking about attendance, we have had parents that are complaining to the board that the enrollment of the schools are too high. And you are a parent at JW where the enrollment was 2,000. So when TSAS was open, that lessened the attendance, okay? But, you know, we leave these things to the superintendent. But please, he didn't come down here to be intimidated, be questioned. And then one question is, the superintendent may not be the superintendent. Do you guys know something that we don't know?
Chair.
That's an insult, because I'm getting texts from employees right now about that we're watching. Senator, we are here to work together. We are here to work together.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order. Stay your point of order.
It was corrected that you brought up the point of information that the contract still exists for the superintendent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your point of order. Vice Speaker Talai, you still have the floor.
Mr. Chair, I'm asking a very simple question. If there is a master plan at DOE regarding the need for northern schools, I want to know what those numbers look like, and I want to know the rationale for determining the current specifications for the Simon Sanchez High School that is in part of the ongoing procurement. The current ongoing procurement, according to DPW, specifies that Simon Sanchez has a current population of 1,900, and we're predicting a 20% growth rate of 2,300. So I just want to know, do you have a master plan that also echoes the growth rate for the northern schools or the need for a northern high school? Is there any additional need for northern high schools?
There is an additional. We had our town hall meeting, and we had our stakeholders are asking, can you build another school in the north? Because the growth in the north, if you live in the north, you would know that there's housing developments up and down, going up. So that's even the request is just not build another school in the north, elementary, middle, and high school, because it will grow. It will be growing up. So we cannot. Of course, there is a need.
Well, that's my understanding, but now I'm concerned that I want to know whether we know those numbers now. Did we know those numbers even when we started the procurement on Simon Sanchez? I thought we knew these numbers. We always know that we have to know these numbers for years in order to tell the legislature when we needed to build Ukudu. Didn't we have to come up with a master plan of how many northern schools we need? Things like that. So that's all I'm asking. If there's an existing document that shows that, that's all I want, is whatever you have that's existing, that's either been adopted by the board or by the superintendent, either one that shows that need. And I told the superintendent during the break that I very much want to know what we've documented as need for northern schools, and because I'm assuming that was used, as the basis for the Simon Sanchez procurement, and also in our discussions with the United States Department of Education as to that available land that we are now might have to give up for not using it. I just want to know, are we portraying that we don't need any more northern schools, and what do our formal official documents show us? Is there a master plan or not, or something like that? That's my question.
Will you allow the superintendent to respond?
The superintendent will answer that.
Yeah, so I think in line with what Senator Castro said in our discussion about Marble, we will provide you the official information that we have relative to the need for any northern schools that we have. Now, I want to make clear that there was identified by former Speaker Wampat and the genesis of this legislation. It was intended, we had a planning function within the Department of Education, and Senator Castro reminded me, but that no longer exists, or didn't exist when I came in. And so when I came on board, I worked with Senator Wampat, and as part of the legislation that authorized this entire, it was supposed to be $100 million worth of support, it was put in there that there would be funding for a comprehensive capital improvement plan. Because we are at this stage and the procurements that happen have never completed, that would never materialize in terms of funding. So we do include that as part of our budget requests and so forth. What I am hopeful for is in this discussion with the funding available, and hopefully we can address that to be able to move forward with a comprehensive capital improvement plan, which will then update all the information we have.
Are you saying that there's none that exists? We have no documentation as to the need?
We have documentation that we'll provide to you. There isn't a master plan that is updated
well, it's not updated. What's the last one?
Right.
I want to know what the existing record shows.
What I will do is provide that to you.
Yes, I've been asking that over and over. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you're recognized on the amendment.
Just to try to clarify that, Mr. Superintendent, it might help the body if you would just admit that your recent trip to US DOE was to get land for an additional school. It's not, there's no question we have to rebuild Simon, but you are planning on another high school, and that was the reason for which you went to either get the Marble property back, which is not going to happen, but you're trying to get a different piece of land. Please assure the body that you are working on that.
Correct. So Senator Talahi requested, in the recess, that documentation. So we will provide it to her, and she, saw the story in the paper, which kind of described the recent visit. So when we were able to, determine that we could rebuild Simon Sanchez High School at its current site, the need for a high school within a couple miles seemed to be less of a need at that particular location. When US DOE approached us and said, are you going to utilize this given the remaining years you have on your lease, we engaged them to determine whether we would be able to cure the lease, right? And they said, essentially it said that US DOD has put this as a high priority, and that pretty much that they were not going to be able to facilitate that request. So since that time, we've been working with Congresswoman Bardalio to figure out if there is a solution, and the solution that we are proposing is that at the corner of existing DOD property, closer to Guam Home Center, on a property about the same size as the Marbo, and closer to the density that's in that location in Dededo, we're proposing that be considered as a land swap, so that Marbo reverts, and we will have that. And as part of the justification for that swap has been, number one, because Simon Sanchez will be rebuilt at its current location, there is a need to relieve the pressure in terms of the enrollment in that Dededo area and on the cusp of Jigo. This attendance area exercise that we're going through right now will give us better numbers. Right now, we are currently struggling with the fact that we can't service all of the students in the same middle schools. And of course, GCC has put forth its proposal for a middle college. And so those are the two options that we would like to pursue, and have made that clear with the Congresswoman, that should her legislation go through, should there be a swap, that would be the use for that property. We also confirmed that as part of the net negative discussion, this Marble property is 80 acres. If it's assumed back into DOD's portfolio, they have to offset it somewhere. And so that's the proposal, to also comply with the net negative commitment. So that's the path of resolution that we're pursuing at this point.
Thank you,
may
Mr.
just
Fernandez. And that
clarify,
was in response to Speaker Cruz. Anything else, Speaker Cruz? You still have the floor.
Thank you, I'm done, sir.
Okay.
That was the answer that I was hoping would assure the members.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Vice Speaker Talai, you had final comment?
Oh, I just wanted to clarify, that's exactly why I've been asking for this information, and in relation, and why I brought up the article in the newspaper about the 80 acres that have been not used, and because DOE continues to tell us that they do not have any concrete numbers, any concrete prediction, and it looks like that perhaps to DOD, or to US DOE, that we just don't have that need in writing, and we're waiting for the realigning attendance areas hearings or something, and that's why I'm asking if they have any existing documentation that shows need. I thought I've heard of this need over all the years, and so that's why I'm surprised that there's nothing in writing before us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Speaker Talai. The superintendent has assured the body that that information will be provided through Speaker Cruz's office. Any further discussion on the amendment? If not, Senator San Nicolas, did you want to close?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I wanted to clarify a couple points. The first is that this amendment, the intent of this amendment is to make sure that we're having a 30-year mindset with respect to facility needs at Simon Sanchez. This isn't to address the student population throughout the entire island. And one of my concerns, actually, Mr. Chairman, with the nature of the discussion is that that was actually one of the issues that caused this procurement delay in the first place, was not bifurcating the total needs of the school district with the needs of Simon Sanchez. And it was the commingling of that actually caused that to be delayed, because Simon Sanchez wasn't able to move forward because everything was getting tied up in protests with respect to all the other needs of the Department of Education. So in moving forward, we factored out Simon Sanchez, and now that we're trying to move forward the building of Simon Sanchez, I'm just concerned that trying to circle back and reintegrate the conversation of the entire district is going to put us back into a situation where we're going to be putting the building of the school once again at risk. The amendment is very clear, Mr. Chairman. It's to factor in the projected growth of the student population over the term of the leaseback. So if we're going to have a 30-year debt, I want to make sure that we're building a school that's going to meet the needs of the community for the next 30 years. And the Department of Education will determine how to factor in that particular school's population needs. If we have land elsewhere, other schools to be built under other circumstances, of course, those will all be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. But I want to make sure that in this case, this particular leaseback is factoring in the student population growth over the entire 30 years. We've seen what happened at Ukadu, where there needed to be an expansion, which, you know, in light of some of the discussion is kind of curious, because now we have a 1,500 student population, but a 2,000 student capacity, which is interesting because we had to expand the school, and now we have that capacity. So I'm sure the department will figure that out. But I want to make sure that when we do Simon Sanchez, that we're not going to be, falling into that same set of circumstances and having to layer borrowing on top of borrowing when this is supposed to be a one-time shot. Additionally, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to add that I know that it was referenced a previous law about school size, and we always, and that's actually something to really be mindful of, because will that be grounds for another protest? That this bid was not in conformity with public law such and such. And perhaps we need to include in this bill, notwithstanding, and I'll get to you, Mr. Chairman, because this is your legislation, but perhaps we need to include a section here, notwithstanding public law, whatever that number is, so that this school, because the population is already over 1,700. And so if we're also factoring in growth, which we should, I think that notwithstanding that public law, we should perhaps just include it in the language so that the school can get built. Mr. Chairman, the need to keep schools at a certain size is admirable, but when we're unable to build schools at a rate that's able to keep up with that mandate, and we're putting ourselves into a situation where the existing assets are being, Mr. Chairman, I went to JQ San Miguel for 3rd grade, and when I went back to that school, even just, gosh, I think it was 5 years ago, I didn't recognize it. It had like all kinds of stuff built all over it. It's amazing what the Department of Education is able to do to meet this population needs. But that's an example of just how things change over time. And if we don't provision for the change in our planning, we're going to have schools turning into these very strange monstrosities that are being built in very, very odd ways just to meet the population needs. And then we're also going to have circumstances where we're having temporary classrooms being bought and put into schools that all of a sudden become in tomorrow temporary permanent, where it's supposed to last 5 years and there it is 20 years later. And so I'm asking us to pass this amendment so that we're not going to have that happen in this case. And it's even more concerning when it's a leaseback school, because then the landlord sets the terms. And if we didn't provision for that in the beginning, they may say, we're not going to add any other buildings here, and then what do? Then all of a sudden we have a crisis where we're not able to accommodate in the new facility. Where do the students go? And that's also one of the issues with respect to trying to negotiate a double session with some of these leaseback schools, because the landlord controls the terms. And if the landlord doesn't want to do a double session, then you can't fit them. And then what happens? The students just got to get all squeezed into the one school that they're able to go to. And after this, that'll leave what? Southern High and GW? And so all of a sudden, if we don't have provisions for growth and we're not able to get the landlords to accommodate the growth, then the department's going to end up jamming more kids into the existing assets. And the students will suffer. The learning environment will suffer. And we don't want our students to suffer. So let's provision for growth. I think that it's very, very prudent to do so. I appreciate some of the sentiments from my colleagues expressing that that would be something that we should do. And let's provision for growth with respect to this project and not put the entire project at risk by trying to tie in the entire needs of the department, which is a conversation that we've had over the course of this procurement over the last several years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator St. Nicholas. Any further, I'm sorry, he just closed the discussion. Any objection on the proposed amendment? Any objection on the proposed amendment? There's an expression of objection. All those in favor of the amendment, please signify by raising your hand. So what? What's the requirement? No, what's the requirement? What's the requirement? Yeah. Amendment fails. Any further discussion on page 4, section 4? Senator St. Nicholas, you still have the floor.
Thank you,
And
Mr.
then
Chairman.
Senator
I just wanted
Esparza.
to inquire. I noticed that over the course of this bill, In section 2, we're amending responsive offer. In section 3, we're amending the definition of responsive. But if we look at page 4, line 13, we also have the term responsible offerer. And I'm curious, was this this definition was left unchanged in this bill? And I'm curious if that was by design, or if it was a potential oversight. And I just wanted to make sure, because as we're looking at recrafting the law, I wanted to make sure that this particular definition was something that was also looked at. And in the existing statute, it reads, responsible bidder or offerer means a person who has the capability in all respects to perform fully the contract requirements and the integrity and reliability which will assure good faith performance. There's no change to that definition in this bill, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to inquire if that was by design, leaving it intentionally.
Senator St. Nicholas, you're referencing sub-item 2 on page 4?
Page 4, section 4, line 13, the determination of responsible offerers.
That's within the existing law?
Right. And so we're not going to be changing the definition of responsible offerer. We're just going to be leaving it.
That's
as
correct.
Is. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator St. Nicholas. Senator Espadon on page 4, section 4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, yesterday I kind of went down the road of differentiating between invitation to bid, a request for proposal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So on line number 12, well, I'll just read the whole sentence. The solicitation shall specifically state the minimum specifications that will be required for a submitted proposal to be considered. Yesterday we were talking about a bid. So a proposal, the term proposal, I think almost implicates a request for proposal. So I would like to amend that word proposal and change it to offer. So now the sentence will read, the solicitation shall specifically state the minimum qualifications that will be required for a submitted offer to be considered. That way it's very broad and it doesn't really tie in the procurement to a specific type of solicitation, whether it be a request for a proposal or a request for bid or whatnot. So that's a simple amendment, but again, we all know that the devil is in the details, and that's why I believe it's important that we make that change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. On line 12, page 4, the proposed amendment is to delete the word proposal and insert offer. So like the senator said, the language will read, the solicitation shall specifically state the minimum specifications that will be required for a submitted offer to be considered. On the proposed amendment, any objections? No objections? So ordered. Senator Espadon, you still have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, are we still just relegated to examine what's on page 4 or under the whole section 4?
We are still discussing the provisions in page 4.
Thank you. I have no other issues.
Okay.
Thank you.
Moving on, senators, to page 5. Any questions, comments, or yes? Vice Speaker Talai, you recognize.
Yes, on page 4, I just have two questions. One is, what does DOE intend to include in a new solicitation as the capacity of the new Simon Sanchez High School?
Mr. Fernandez.
We will base that, again, on the revised enrollment numbers once we get through this attendance area exercise.
When do you intend to complete that?
We're targeting for May. Right now, there are village meetings. We've met with the mayors. We've met internally with our stakeholders. Ultimately, the board would have to approve it, so probably around mid to late May, that'll be finalized.
Mrs. Gutierrez, will the board be approving the number that's going to be put into this solicitation for a new Simon Sanchez High School? Apparently, there was a number put into the last solicitation that the board did not approve, 2,300. So is it your opinion that the board will be approving the number that goes into the new solicitation?
What we're doing, Senator, Vice Speaker, is we're still, in fact, we will be meeting next week up in the north for the town hall. And as much as the parents are, stakeholders are saying, parents are saying that the enrollment really is really high, and that requesting that they go lower. So there's a proposal from the committee that is still with under the superintendent. I just sit there with the committee members just to listen and offer some guidance, because I've been on this board since 1991. I have been to 3 reassignment of attendance area. And based on that, we will see what the stakeholders will have to do. I invite all of you starting tonight, Finnegajan. We're all going to be in the north tonight till May 3rd to join us 6 o'clock. So you can hear the stakeholders. It's a good time for you guys to be there because it's election year. But listen to the stakeholders, because that's what we're doing. We're leading this committee that is assigned by the superintendent, but we also take the input and recommendation and concern of the stakeholders, because especially the Simon Sanchez stakeholders, too bad the kids are in school right now. They wanted to come down. But we will look at that, and so that we do not have more than, make sure that the school that the enrollment will be something that will be acceptable to the stakeholders, because that's one of the concerns as many of the parents, that is the overcrowding and the lack of funding to hire additional staff to supervise the students. So we are taking this seriously. The committee will end their town hall May 3rd. From there, they'll submit their final proposal to the superintendent, then it comes to the board for work session. From then, the board will look at the recommendation. And it takes 5 members to approve, so we'll see. I'm only one of them. But I invite all of you to come in, starting tomorrow, Finnegajan Elementary School, and then we move on. We have the schedule.
Thank you. So is there a specific recommendation by the committee that they are proposing to the public to comment on regarding Simon Sanchez enrollment?
That's the purpose of the town hall meeting.
Yeah, so what
that
is
we're
that
conducting.
number that's being proposed to the public? Maybe we can just announce it today so they can go.
Well, they'll see, what they show the public is this is the total enrollment. You're making this movement. This would be either a minus or a plus.
Right. What
and
is
then,
the movement that they're proposing?
We will hear from them if they are in a, do they support or they have some concern.
Yeah, so what is the proposal that we're presenting to the public to comment on? What numbers?
I think I mentioned it earlier. My recollection is around 1,700 to 1,750 at Simon Sanchez.
Okay. And then my other question is, what is the difference in subsection 2 of, what's the difference? So this is a committee. We're talking about the evaluation committee, and we're changing the evaluation committee. So in the past, the superintendent of the Department of Education was on the evaluation committee, but how does this change now the evaluation committee? Are all the members the same?
Yes. So when the first draft of this bill took out the evaluation committee component, I suggested we put it back in. And then the reason why is I didn't want there to be a signal that there would not be the ability to cooperate and collaborate with our partner agencies throughout this process. So we asked that we just continue to keep that evaluation process in place. The only thing that would change in the subsequent subsection would be that it would be the superintendent making the final decision based on the input of the evaluation committee. And that would be in line with the authority to do the procurement in the first place. So I think the last time it was DPW would be the final say after the evaluation committee did its work. And this just maintains the committee. Superintendent then would do the final approval.
So the exact same members of the committee
Correct.
that are on the current procurement, just changing the chairperson or what are they
The
called?
final approval.
Point of information, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator, that's what I'm
Actually,
stating.
since we're addressing only subsection A2, The only difference is that under existing law, EPA is on the committee. Under this law, under this legislation, EPA is not on the committee.
I stand corrected. Thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
That's correct.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Madam Vice Speaker, you still have the floor.
And Mr. Leon Guerrero, in your previous procurements, what is the role of the evaluation committee? I mean, they review the proposals and then they vote, and then do you tally up the votes?
That is correct.
Is there any discretion to depart from the person who got the most, the highest ranking or rating?
Yeah, normally, an evaluator is given a set of tools to make an evaluation, whether it be the final amount proposed for the construction of any project, whether it be whether they are responsible and responsive to the solicitation, whether they have had good standing as far as being a contractor on Guam, whether or not their proposal meets the specs that are required through this process, through this procurement. So those are the tools that they need to look at so that they can form a more educated evaluation, so that at the end of the day, they will come up with the best contractor, the best bidder, so that they would be eventually awarded should there not be any protests.
Okay, I'm just trying to figure out the difference between the last procurement and the future procurement under this law. So we have one different person, EPA's out, but the same people will be voting, or besides EPA, will be voting, evaluating the offers. And is there discretion then? Did DPW have discretion to award to someone other than what the committee had decided was the best offer?
No, we don't have that discretion.
So in changing the discretion over to the superintendent, or the awarding power to the superintendent, do you foresee any difference, I guess, Mr. Superintendent?
I don't see much difference. I think as I recollect, I know Mr. Leon Guerrero wasn't at that, involved in that particular committee, but in that committee, there were evaluations of the proposals, and I used a numeric ranking system, and those were tallied up and then presented to the Director of Department of Public Works, and then based on that, there was a ranking. So it wasn't, from there, the process would involve not an award, but a negotiation with the highest ranked offerer, and then if that negotiation is successful, then it would be an award. But if not successful, you would have a ranking, so you would go to the second, third, and so forth. So that was the process, and in this particular process, I would hope the committee, I would intend the committee to do the same thing, except I would take the place of Department of Public Works.
And do you foresee any discretion to depart from what the evaluation committee has determined in its ranking?
The only difference would be, there would be, no, I mean, you're right, the focus would be on responsibility and responsiveness. So the same criteria.
All right. And Mr. Chair, if you could just clarify the inclusion of financing in this bill as opposed to the original 204, the purpose of that?
That's primarily, Madam Vice Speaker, that's primarily to ensure that the superintendent has the flexibility to be able, if you notice at the inception, there was a discussion about bifurcating the process and acquiring some additional support for the Department of Education. So in this particular case, it would be inclusive of financing, how the financing is going to be acquired.
I recall this being suggested by one of the bidders, but did the other bidder or any other bidder have any input as to whether to include financing or not? I don't recall. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Vice. Senator Tamata, on page 4 or moving forward to page 5?
Well, I want to comment on paragraph 3, starting on page 4,
Okay.
on to page 5.
Okay, Senator Ada, you're recognized.
So the way that is written right now, the committee shall evaluate offerers and offers received based on the requirements set forth in the solicitation for renovation or construction of the education facility. So I interpret that to mean that that is the only submittal that the committee will evaluate. But we have given, since this, given the authority to the superintendent or to the DOE to solicit for the OAE, for the A&E, for the construction manager. So we need to expand that then insofar as what they have the authority to evaluate. And so I would just, the language would be, shall evaluate.
Senator Ada, if I can, based on just discussion with the superintendent, just to provide clarity to the concern you brought up, he is suggesting that right after solicitation, insert a period and then delete the balance of that sentence.
There's something to that.
If you want to take that route, or do you still want to?
Oh, no, that's fine. Okay, that's good.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Ada. So on Senator Ada's proposed amendment on line 1, page 5, to insert right after the word solicitation, period, and then delete the balance of that particular sentence. Any discussion? No objections? So ordered. Thank you, Senator Ada. Senator Ada, you still have the floor.
I'm just, now, then of course we've added the language upon completion of the committee's evaluation, the superintendent shall issue the award. Now, I don't know if we need to put the qualifying language in there in accordance with the Guam procurement law, because we know that the award, of course, has to be issued in writing. I'm not sure what else I quickly was trying to go through the procurement law to see what, the other hoops are that need to be jumped. So I think to cover that, that the award shall issue the award in accordance with the Guam procurement law.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada. On line 3, page 5, Senator Ada's amendment is to insert the words right after award, comma, in accordance with the procurement law. Any discussion on that proposed amendment? Any objections? Vice Speaker Talai, you recognize.
Thank you. Mr. Superintendent, do you foresee using only IFBs, or will there also be RFPs?
So my understanding is that it's somewhat, I believe the OAE would be categorized as professional services and therefore would be an RFP. And then I think when we were looking at the construction financing, that would lend itself more towards a multi-step. So
yes, so it's not necessarily after an evaluation that you're going to issue an award if it's an RFP, right?
Correct. That's why I would be supportive of the proposed amendment. That would make sense.
Yeah, construction management will also be an RFP.
Correct.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure this is consistent with how our current procurement law, states the process. Otherwise, maybe just delete the entire sentence so that you proceed with the process as you're required to by law. Either you negotiate or you do whatever, and then you award, or you award if it's an IFB. I'm not sure if this is necessary or if it adds potential.
As long as that's clear. As long as that's clear.
For ambiguity.
So, Madam Vice Speaker, are you objecting to the amendment? Because we're still discussing the amendment.
Well, I'm just trying to clarify if it. I have no objection to that amendment, but the sentence I'm thinking might cause you some more problems.
Mr. Fernandez?
I think similar to the discussion about the OAE and the roles of the procuring agency director, it was simply to just be clear that the evaluation committee simply provides its results to the superintendent, and then the superintendent issues the award. It was just to provide extra clarification or assurance that that's the role of the evaluation committee, was just to provide its final results to the superintendent to facilitate the remainder of the procurement. So if it's understood, and I think that's the question, if it's understood, I would agree that I would read this law that the superintendent is in charge of issuing the award and completing the procurement. And this might be redundant if that's, I suggested it just to be clear, but you're right that it might be redundant if it's understood that procurement law already requires that the superintendent be the final authority on the procurement.
Sorry, may I ask one more question? Mr. Leon Guerrero, was the rest of the evaluation committee involved in the negotiations, or was it solely DPW?
I'm sorry, were the evaluators involved in?
Subsequent negotiations with the contractor?
No, the evaluators are not. The
Only
evaluators,
DPW?
The
It was only
evaluators are
DPW?
convened. The proposals are given to them. They evaluate it. They determine who the number one candidate, 2, 3, and 4. They get ranked, and then after that, whomever's in charge of the procurement process, whoever
Right.
that person is, will then issue out the award. But in no way do they sit down and negotiate with the contractors.
Okay, because I thought that while they were negotiating, they had to have input from DOE, that was written into the solicitation somehow, wasn't it?
Right, I think in the last law, there was, I think it was put in there just to ensure that DOE's input was considered, throughout every stage. So that was the intent of that prior law.
So the intent of this is that solely DOE will negotiate with these potential contractors.
Correct.
On the amendment by Senator Ada, Speaker Cruz, you're recognized. On the amendment, please.
I just want to congratulate both the superintendent and the director for the way that they've been trying to answer the questions. And I think our colleagues have to be aware of the fact that we're still in protest of the current bid. And some of their answers have been oblique because of the fact that they don't want to violate the current procurement that's in protest. So please be aware of the questions and not be too specific on the current bid, because you're going to place them in a real predicament.
My apologies, Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Senator Ada's amendment, in accordance with the procurement law, to insert that after the word award on page 5, line number 3. Any further discussion? No further discussion. Is there an objection? No objection. So ordered. Senator San Agustin, you're recognized on page 5.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, first on page 5, I notice that the paragraphs are not marked correctly. But I'd like to move the whole section there of line 9 to line 12, move it to the end of line 20. So they'll be consistent. The award of the contract shall be based upon, and it's consistent with the solicitation of, starting from line 13, at the end of it, line 20, moving that whole B. And if they can put the letters in the proper sequence, because there was no A, but there's a B, and then C would be an A, and so forth.
Thank you very much, Senator San Agustin. The A is on, on page 4. But on Senator San Agustin's proposed amendment is to take subsection B, lines 9 to 12, and insert it at the end of line 20. And because this was in dialogue with the superintendent, I'd like to ask him to please provide some clarity in terms of the proposed amendment. Mr. Superintendent?
I think so. Based on the prior amendments and the discussion of the OAE and fragmenting this procurement, this subsection B, which was in the original draft of the legislation, really refers to the leaseback arrangement. And so that leaseback would only be applicable to the construction and renovation work on Simon Sanchez High School, and not applicable to any solicitation of OAE services or other services. So it really was just to make sure that it was clear that this discussion about evaluating on the basis of the lowest annual leaseback payment is specific to the solicitation for the construction and renovation of Simon Sanchez High School and the lease to the landlord.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. Any discussion on the proposed amendment by the Chair of Education? Senator San Nicolas? On the amendment.
To move B down to below C, Mr. Chairman, is that correct? So we're not
at the end of the paragraph
at the end of C. All right. I agree with the amendment. I think that sequentially it makes sense. There are some detail, though, within the language that we would need to further amend, but on this amendment is.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. Any objection on the proposed amendment? Once again, the amendment is to take some item B the entire section and add it to sub-item C, and then to re-numerate or re-alphabetize the sections accordingly. Any objections? No objections? So ordered. Thank you, Senator San Agustin. Senator San Agustin, you still have the floor.
Nothing else.
Thank you, Senator San Agustin. Any other questions, comments, or concerns on page 5? Senator Espadon, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is in reference to subsection 4, and it'll be starting on line 4. It reads, GDOE shall be authorized to solicit one or more entities to perform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This gives the authorization to GDOE just to solicit from one entity. And I think we have a concern with that. In other words, instead of putting the solicitation out for general, for as many bidders as possible, they could elect to just go with one solicitation to one entity. So I move that we delete the words one or more, and that way it will read, GDOE shall be authorized to solicit entities to perform any or all the following related. That way it just ensures that there is, just no special consideration just for one specific company, and it'll be a transparent process.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon, and that's consistent with some of our prior discussions with regards to the additional requirements for OAE. So on line 4, Senator Espadon has proffered an amendment to delete the words one or more. So it will now read, should this be adopted, GDOE shall be authorized to solicit entities to perform, and then continue on. On that amendment, any objections? No objections? So ordered. Thank you, Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all.
Can we take a 30-second recess, please? Good morning, Senators. Committee on the Whole is now back in session. Just FYI, I wanted to make sure that with all the amendments that were being proffered, that the clerk was annotating all these changes, because I've given allowances when in fact the amendments are brief in nature, that we can entertain it. But Senators, please ensure that when you receive the documents that you sign off and you acknowledge that the proper amendment was adopted. Okay, Senator St. Nicholas on page 5. Any questions, comments, or?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to discuss on page 5 the entire section 4, lines 4 to 8. Just for colleagues' reference, this is a double underlined section, which means it's entirely new language being added into the law. And when I read it in the context of the entire section 4, it looks almost like a completely separate blanket authorization for the department outside of the scope of the project. It reads, GDOE shall be authorized to solicit entities to perform any or all of the following related activities: architectural and engineering design, development of a comprehensive capital improvement plan, construction management, purchase of collateral equipment, and long-term capital maintenance planning. And when I read this, Mr. Chairman, like, for example, the comprehensive capital improvement plan is outside of the scope of the Simon Sanchez project. And the solicitation for long-term capital maintenance planning could be for the entire department. And the purchase of collateral equipment could be for anything even outside of Simon Sanchez. And so this section almost looks like a blanket authorization for DOE to go out and solicit for these items under the authorizations or under the procedures that are being crafted here in Section A, because it's a subsection to Section A. And so I'm just curious as to why this entirely new language is being added, and why it kind of looks like it's broadening the scope of DOE's mandate outside of Simon Sanchez.
Thank you very much, Senator St. Nicholas. Just to initially respond to that, the recommendation originated from the superintendent primarily, so that in fact, well, some of the concerns that were raised during the course of the public hearing was a master plan. Some of the issues that were raised was how are you going to deal with collateral equipment, and your concern with regards to inserting that into this particular provision certainly is well recognized. So I'm going to ask the superintendent to also respond.
No, I think that's a very good question. So the issue is, now that we have gone through the prior Section A and we've entertained both the OAE as a support, as well as outlined the services that they would be able to assist with, that is in parts redundant, and it looks like it's redundant with some of the functions that have been outlined in Section 4. So the intent, I believe, when this language was added, is not simply from DOE. There was public testimony from one of the stakeholders regarding the possibility of not only breaking up the procurement and doing design first, which is what we had supported, but that there might be the opportunity to do the A&E design. And they broke it out in just a little bit more detail: construction management, long-term maintenance planning. So I think it was really to reflect the opportunity to do that. So, but I do think you're right that it's somewhat redundant with A, and that A covers most of these activities. I do think that because prior procurements allowed for the development of comprehensive plan to be addressed in the A&E process, that you're right that it can be debated as whether this should be in the scope. One of the things I do want to point out, though, is that the purchase of collateral equipment, the reason we wanted to insert and make sure it was clear that we could solicit for that separately is that we didn't want to include that in the leaseback arrangement. So I think that the idea that we would purchase student desks and then pay for it over a 30-year period, we wanted to remove from the leaseback arrangement and approach that as a separate solicitation. So I think I would be open to, myself, I would be supportive of removing any redundancy, but I would ask that there at least be some clarity around the ability to purchase collateral equipment with the same source of funding potentially, but outside of a leaseback arrangement, so we don't have to pay the additional borrowing costs. Are you,
Senator
that makes
Nicholas?
sense? So,
Yeah, no, I totally follow. I'm thinking though that perhaps it may need to be separate legislation because if we're going to be and that kind of takes me to some of the other language that I'll be discussing later, Mr. Chairman, because this entire page 5, the bulk of it is authorization for the, a long-term leaseback arrangement, and the A&E, I think we've already discussed, should be outside of the long-term leaseback arrangement. And then as the superintendent shared, the purchase of collateral equipment, they want to have the option of having that outside of the long-term leaseback arrangement. And so I think if we take these items out, then everything just falls to the solicitation. So whatever you put into the solicitation is what you'll be committing to on the long-term leaseback. If you do not include collateral equipment, then an offeror could put it there, but then they're going to have to potentially eat the cost of, losing their bid because it's outside of what was necessary, and if someone didn't put that and they come in lower, then you're able to award to them. So I think if we were to remove that section 4, I think that it would be okay, because what I'm concerned about is this section 4 is a subsection to A, and A is the authorization for DOE to go out and do all of these things, and it may open the door for solicitations to include all of these items, and it actually narrows the ability for other service providers to participate because they're not able to provide all of these different services.
Thank you, Senator Nicholas. In that particular case, I think the superintendent wanted to emphasize one particular component, which he just mentioned. So, Mr. Fernandez?
yeah. If I could, so this is, I know they were doing section by section, but this is one of those instances where we might want to connect the dots, right? So the dot that needs to be connected, and then you'll understand where I think where the intent was. On page 6 under section 5, the added language was specific to the funding that was set aside to support the leaseback arrangement. So the added language there was rental payments under the lease and leaseback, as well as funding required to support the activities set forth in 58D 105A4, which is the section we're referencing, may be secured by the government of Guam from this revenue source. So when we go back to A4, I guess the clarity that I was wanting to ensure was that there was a source of funding available. So remember that when we were doing an all-in-one bid, the services that we were looking at in terms of design, collateral equipment, and so forth are basically already incorporated into that source of funding. So that funding was intended to address all of it in one bid. So what I'm asking for at this point is that simply some clarity that the funding source may be available to support some of the activities. Maybe it's in section A instead of A4, 4, but that I would like to see purchase of collateral equipment included in some fashion, because I don't want to move forward with authority to build the school and then obviously we're trying to figure out where the collateral equipment is going to come is, I would like to go forward with at least a notion that we're going to be able to fund collateral equipment as well. So that would be the complete project and limited to Simon Sanchez. But I think I'm okay with that. So we can keep the scope to Simon Sanchez, make sure that the funding available under this source of funds is available to cover some of these costs. But I also would like to ask that collateral equipment be allowed to be funded, but not necessarily as a leaseback purchase.
The collateral equipment is specific to Simon Sanchez.
Correct. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just concerned because if we do it the way this is originally written, it almost looks like we're circling back again to lumping in the overall department with the specific project. Because, for example, the comprehensive capital improvement plan, that's a department-wide need versus specific to the Simon Sanchez project. And looking at that section 4 and tying it to what the superintendent pointed out on page 6, there's a potentiality for it all to kind of get tied up together. And so I just wanted to reassure the superintendent that the rental payments under the lease and leaseback, that's already existing law, and adding this new language as well as funding required to support the activities set forth in subsection 58D 105A4, which is the section I'm referencing here. I think that if those items need additional funding, we can definitely use that same funding source in separate legislation. But I'm worried that if we tie it all together under this one project, it kind of takes us back in time to that same problem we had, where there was a commingling of the Simon Sanchez rebuild with the Department of Education's needs outside of Simon Sanchez, the overall capital improvement needs.
Senator St. Nicholas, I believe the superintendent has looked at the primary concern that he has at this point in time in utilizing the same funding source is the ability to be able to purchase collateral equipment. So the other provisions, like you hinted at, already has been mentioned in sub-item A. So if you would like to consider possibly incorporating the purchase of collateral equipment into sub-item A so that everything else can be extracted accordingly based on where you're leading towards. That as long as he has that flexibility with the same funding source so that the Department of Education is not left with a massive structure that we still have to be able to go out and secure the collateral equipment.
Right, but I think the superintendent was also clear that he did not want to include it in the leaseback. He wanted to be able to procure that outside of the leaseback.
So what I would ask, I mean, one other possibility I think would work, given that we've made the amendments have been made to section A, that 4 could be struck in its entirety. But I would ask that in section 5, under the added language where it says funding the activities set forth, that it would be say section 58D105A and the purchase of collateral equipment. And it simply is to authorize a source of funding. Again, that would be, as the senators mentioned, contingent on the availability of funding. It would be contingent on the amount pledged for the leaseback, but it would be separate and apart from the leaseback arrangement. So that would be, I think, fulfill the intent.
I see. So we can strike the section 4 here, and then also strike the number 4 on line 16, page 6.
Right. But I would ask you if you could add and purchase of collateral equipment simply to have the authorization available should funds be sufficient. And I just say that because the intent was the entire stream of funding was to support all of those activities, but I think we can do it cheaper in some other way without incurring all the interest costs on a student desk and chair. So
that's music to my ears. I'm absolutely in favor of that. And so if I may beg the indulgence, could we strike section 4 and then I'll move on to another amendment that may address the superintendent's concerns with respect to the section B that we recently moved to section C, because that section B there, it kind of limits the entire project to a leaseback.
Yeah, so that's under...
Right, and so that's kind of where we need to start carving out A&E and maybe collateral equipment. So if I may first satisfy the amendment to strike section 4, Mr. Chairman, and then we can move on to subsection B.
There's a motion to delete section 4, page 5. Senator Espadon on the proposed amendment.
Just for clarification, section 4 is the whole section, including A and B and C and D. So are we talking about subsection 4A? Subsection 4 of subsection 4?
Sub-item 4 is number
4.
4 under subsection A.
Right.
If you revert back to page 4, you got sub-item 1, sub-item 2, sub-item 3, and then that's sub-item 4 of section A.
Right. So we are moving, the motion is to delete subsection A4?
Correct.
Just A4?
Just A4.
Okay, because the motion was to strike section 4.
Correct.
And this whole area is section 4, so just A4.
Just A4, correct. Thank you for that clarification, Senator Espadon. On the amendment.
Mr. Chair, and again, I'm not arguing for or against it, but I just want to make sure we point out that under this subsection also, and it hasn't really been addressed, it changes the amount of time in which the solicitation shall be issued, which presently is at 30 days, and this expands it now to 45 days. So just for, again, a point of consideration by the members, that if the intent was to really give it a little more time of, from 30 days to 45 days, if we strike this section, we remain at 30 days.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. I'll entertain that when you have the floor. Let's dispose of the proposed amendment.
That is part of the amendment, and then again, that was just part, and again, I just wanted to make note that by striking this whole section, right, then we just strike that area as well. Actually,
Senator Espadon, it would be A4, not sub-item B, which was incorporated into subsection C. So
Right, Mr. Chair, but just for clarification, subsection A4 includes a subsection B, C, and D. So in the motion to delete subsection A4, you also delete subsection A,
One
B,
minute recess,
C,
please.
D.
1 minute recess. Committee in the whole is now back in session. Senators, there's been a suggestion to recess until 2:30 p.m. No objections?
Mr. Chair?
So ordered.
Before, that's okay, we'll deal with it later.